Hello everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate this conversation with General David Petraeus, a distinguished leader with an exceptional 37-year career in the U.S. Army, including commands in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as director of the CIA.
Greatest job in government.
Exactly. Currently, you are a partner at KKR, chairman of KKR Global Institute, and a Kissinger Fellow at Yale University. So yes, geopolitics is obviously no mystery for you. In today's rapid evolving global landscape, geopolitics has become a critical driver in corporate strategy, shaping reputational, financial, and human risks. Recent crises like the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, the conflicts in the Middle East have demonstrated that politics always prevails over economics.
Well, it does now.
It does now, but it didn't
15
previous years ago, and we'll get back
Right.
to that. What
Sure.
have we learned from these 10,
Yep.
15 years?
Yep.
And what I think is really interesting is that companies today, I will be blunt, are now facing a new responsibility, a new geopolitical responsibility, alongside their environmental, social, and governance commitments.
All they need to do is establish a KKR Global Institute.
Exactly. Companies today are key players in international relations and are forced to constantly adapt their strategies for resilience, supply chain restructuring, market diversification, regulatory vigilance. And so this requires a new form of flexibility and agility in the increasing uncertainty enhanced by the uncertainty of the geopolitical landscape. Let me do a military metaphor. I often compare risk management to a fighter jet's design. It has an internal fuel tank and an external drop tank. The internal fuel tank represents the core business risks requiring continuous management. It's the operational risks, it's the financial risk, the compliance risk, and of course the human risk. The external drop tank are the less critical but strategically important risk and disposable if necessary. So flexibility is a challenge, but it's a necessity for all companies, banks, financial institutions today. And so General Petraeus, I hope you will allow us and help us to dissipate some of this fog of geopolitics today. I will start with the general big picture question. It has become common to hear in policy circles, business circles, that geopolitics is back.
It's back with a vengeance.
Is it really back?
It is very much back.
Or have
the holiday from history is over.
Have we been denying geopolitics? And what have we learned?
No, I think 11 and a half years ago, when I joined KKR, Henry Kravis and George Roberts were once again ahead of the times, recognizing that geopolitics were going to loom ever larger in investment decisions, would cause more problems for the companies that we buy, and so forth. So we established the KKR Global Institute at a time when the world could be characterized as one of benign globalization. Economics drove geopolitics at that time. The barriers to trade, investment, capital flows, data flows were all being reduced, and globalization, measured by global trade, was going up like this. 11 and a half years later, again, the holiday from history is over. Geopolitics is back with a big vengeance. Geopolitics now very much drives economics. All of those barriers have been going up, have been increasing, and now globalization has become slowbalization, and within it is regionalization. And we're in years already into an era, a new era of protectionism and industrial policy. And that is a huge shift. And so you've now got to very much consider the geopolitical risks as you're conducting the diligence. We do that much more now than we did even 11 and a half years ago. A lot of this, of course, is about the further rise of China, the more aggressive actions by China on the world stage. It's also the first invasion of this type in Europe since the end of World War II, Russia invading its neighbor Ukraine, the renewed conflicts in the Middle East, all of which have implications for economics, trade, and therefore for investment. And again, you've got to be keenly aware, keenly attuned to this. So we've added this geopolitical risk assessment component to the traditional investment process with the deal teams. Also, as you mentioned, the environmental social governance issues analysis and the macroeconomic analysis, and we combine all of that at KKR. By the way, during that 11.5-year period, we've grown from 83 billion under management to over 623 billion. So actually more than the European Investment Bank, I realized. So it's been a period of extraordinary growth, but the geopolitical component has become much greater. The fact is that right now, we believe the world faces the greatest number of threats and challenges and the most complex array of challenges, certainly since the end of the Cold War, and arguably, you can make a case, since the end of World War II. So if you think of the West together, led by the US to be sure, as the guy in the circus who is spinning a lot of different plates simultaneously, these plates represent the different threats and challenges. There are more plates in that tent now than at any time, I'd argue, since the end of World War II at this point. And the biggest of those plates, the one in particular that represents the Western relationship with China, is bigger than all the other plates in the room combined and the tent combined. And that's one that we have to be sure doesn't even wobble if we can prevent it from happening. And that's where we have to ensure that severe competition, which is our National Security Advisor's description of the relationship with China, does not ever end up in real confrontation. And the way to ensure that that's the case, of course, is to ensure that deterrence is rock solid. Deterrence is a result of a potential adversary's perception of two elements: your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. And that second component is really important. And in the book Conflict, again, that in fact I signed last year when I was here, and it's great to be back, of course. In that book, we make the point that what you do in one part of the world reverberates in others. And if you withdraw from Afghanistan when you really don't have to, we had a sustainable policy. Sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. We hadn't lost an American in 18 months, and the cost, 25 billion, whatever it was, out of an $800 billion budget was very affordable. I think that withdrawal actually was one of the elements that led Putin to think that he could get away with the invasion of Ukraine in a way that actually was not the case. But it was also seized on by President Xi, who said, see, can't get on the Americans, undependable partner. You should all recognize that. And by the way, look how it went. They're also a great power in decline. I don't believe either of those, but that action did give credence to that kind of statement, as did the red line in Syria some years back over chemical weapons that turned out not to be a red line, and some other actions. So we have to be really aware that what we do in one part of the world, if you don't do everything you can to help Ukraine in its hour of greatest need, fighting for its very survival and independence, why would they believe you're going to do something out in the South China Sea?
I think that's a crucial point, the interconnectedness
between the
conflicts,
yes.
between the feeders,
right.
between the Euro-Atlantic feeder, the Indo-Pacific
yes.
feeder, the Middle East feeder,
yep.
and so on that. Let's zoom on Ukraine.
Sure.
How do you see the situation today in Ukraine and the endgame from there? And how do you see the role of the United States evolving?
Well, the U.S. is crucial. We should acknowledge that the European countries in aggregate, when it comes to humanitarian assistance, financial and economic and security, have done more than the U.S., a bit more. But when it comes to the security component in particular, the U.S. is just obviously indispensable. And I think we should be doing even more. The situation in Ukraine right now is very challenging. I just made my 4th trip there in the last 18 months, came home about 4 weeks ago. The front lines are difficult for Ukraine right now. They're losing incremental ground every day. It's not strategic yet. It hasn't accumulated into that. But they've got to stabilize these lines at some point in time. The Russians have a huge manpower advantage, obviously. They outgun the Ukrainians. Now they're joined by North Koreans and millions of North Korean artillery rounds and so on. And yet we're restricting the use of our longest range systems on Russian soil when the Ukrainians are attacking every across every red line that Vladimir Putin has established, and he never does anything at the end of the day. But we need to act expeditiously. This is going to be a very hard, long, cold, dark winter in Ukraine. The Russians have systematically attacked and damaged or destroyed every thermal power plant in the country, every hydroelectric power plant in the country, and now they're going after the transformers and the transmission infrastructure around the nuclear plants, because that's one of the big sources of electricity in Ukraine. EU is doing a wonderful job of providing additional several gigawatts, what it is, a day, but it will not be enough. That's going to be really, really hard, and there's a degree of war fatigue among the people that I experienced in this last trip that I've not seen before. We've got to get them hope back. I think what we should be doing is helping Ukraine to change the dynamic in the war. That's, I think, the realistic objective. And as a CIA director, you learn that you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. I'd love to see us be able to help Ukraine liberate all the territory that Russia occupies, some 18 or 19% of their pre-2014 territory. I'm just not sure that's realistic. But what needs to happen is to change the dynamic, to get Vladimir Putin to recognize that he cannot achieve additional gains at acceptable cost. That's really absolutely critical, because there's going to be no meaningful negotiations. The people that say that we're going to force Ukraine to negotiate, or we can change this in 24 hours or whatever it is, that's fantasy, I think, unless you're just going to capitulate. And that is not what we Europeans or Americans or NATO members or the rest of the Western world should want. We do not want to reward Putin for this outrageous, barbaric invasion that has been ongoing. But if you can stabilize those lines, and keep in mind that Russia has lost, killed, and seriously wounded 600,000 Russians. You know, having 5 combat commands as a general officer alone, and writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers almost every night of those commands, I don't know how the Russian commanders and Putin can even deal with this, except to recognize that they don't care about their soldiers. That has to, at some point in time, be an Achilles heel for them. They cannot continue to take this level of casualties, plus the bleeding of their economy. A lot is made that they've increased their growth. Yeah, they're just throwing massive quantities at their military-industrial complex. I don't think those are sustainable. The question is, when is the moment where they are no longer sustainable, and how do we hasten the onset of that moment? That has to be our objective, because again, if we can't do that right here in Europe's backyard, you know, Putin and NATO is riding relatively high. Keep in mind that the greatest gift to NATO since the end of Cold War is Vladimir Putin, who set out to make Russia great again, and what he's really done is make NATO greater. 2 more very impressive countries, by the way, Finland and Sweden. I had their forces under my command in Afghanistan. They're very highly trained, educated, well-equipped, and all the rest of that. I had them in the Balkans as well when I was there as a 1-star. So again, this is a really pivotal moment. We've got to do all that we can. Ukraine itself has to increase its force generation. That is their Achilles heel right now. They're still riding off the wave of patriotism of the first year of the war. Now they've got to do real conscription, build the infrastructure and the institutions to enable that. They passed the law finally, quite a contentious period some months back, and they've got to now generate those additional forces, train, equip, organize, and employ them. That's important, and we need to continue to help fuel their innovation. I've never seen innovation like the Ukrainians have underway. The partnership they have between those who design the unmanned systems, and by the way, it's not just air, it's also maritime and now increasingly ground. The designers, the manufacturers, and those who actually employ them is the tightest I've ever seen. They have a process now that is producing tomorrow's technology for today's war, in contrast to the legacy US process, which produces yesterday's technology for tomorrow's war. We have to make our own changes, and our Pentagon recognizes we need to do that, and they're embarked on this, but there's a lot of obstacles to that. This innovation is really the differentiator for Ukraine right now, given that they're heavily outmanned and outgunned. How does a country that has no navy as we know it, in other words, surface combatants, sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet and push them out of the Western Black Sea? Aerial drones that find the ships, maritime drones made in Ukraine that go out and sink them. And so there's no Russian ships at Sevastopol for the first time in centuries, and they're out of the Black Sea, which enables Ukraine to export grain by the Black Sea, which is crucial to their fiscal bottom line and also to food security in Egypt and other North African countries. Throwing thousands of drones at the Russians on the front lines every single day. The more that we can enable this as well, absolutely the better. I spent an afternoon with the drone battalion. They have now not only an Army, Navy, and Air Force, they have an unmanned systems force. It's a separate military service, way ahead of the rest of us, and we need to learn from them in that regard. But again, the bottom line, we got to help change the dynamic in the war.
On the ground. Thank you so much. Let's move to the Middle East, and you've mentioned, the word pivot. It seems that the United States cannot pivot away.
We cannot. The pivot was a horrible word. Remember, I was also the commander in the Greater Middle East, and then, of course, CIA director. But I had 5 tours in the Greater Middle East in combat.
Yeah.
Plus, and when the word pivot has sent a shiver down the spines of our friends and allies, and then it gave hope to the enemy. And by the way, there's 3 rules for the Middle East that we used to have. Number 1 is never lose sight of who your enemies are and who your friends are, even if you have differences with your friends. And our friends are Israel and the Gulf states. The enemy is Iran, and don't confuse the two. Number 2 is Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there does not stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and as the Europeans know, tsunamis of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into our closest European allies, causing all kinds of domestic political challenges. And then number 3 gets to this word pivot. The U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. And just recognize it, have an enduring presence that is as efficient yet effective as is possible, and use the term rebalance to Asia, which we need to do. There's no question that the most important theater in the world, I would argue for all of the West, but certainly for the U.S., is the Indo-Pacific. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to do all these others. You have to keep all these plates spinning simultaneously, as I described, and I believe it is very, very possible and imperative.
So you mentioned the Indo-Pacific. That's the 3rd theater. China obviously represents an existential threat for the United States. That's a term used in all of the national security documents. It's an economic tech,
it's the
security,
pacing threat.
It's the full package.
And you have to have.
And so how do you assess China's view and role in these 2 conflicts we just described, Ukraine and the Middle East? Because obviously,
well, China's been decidedly unhelpful in Ukraine. Yeah. They're allowing components and spare part, all the parts that are required for Russia's military-industrial complex to flow in. They're doing that actively. And then in the Middle East, again, they have influence, increasing influence, because of course they're importing vastly more oil. We're now an energy self-sufficient, not self-sufficient, we are an energy net exporter. We still need more heavy crude than we produce for our refineries, so we still are not completely but the US is far and away the energy superpower of the world now, just way, way beyond the crude oil and natural gas production, something that we never thought would happen. We didn't even have liquefaction plants when the energy revolution started about 10 or 15 years ago. We had regasification plants, so we had to retool. We are going to be the largest LNG exporter in the world, I think, as well, surpassing Qatar and Australia in a few years or so, which is really quite remarkable. But no, I think China is playing an unhelpful role, arguably, in both of those theaters. But let me come back to the Middle East just for one moment, because I think it's very important. First of all, we never can lose sight of how traumatic 10/7 was for Israel. And I've been there recently as well. I have a very close relationship with Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant and a lot of the old generals that are there. Keep in mind, the U.S. lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent for us of what Israel sustained would be 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. You can't forget that. This is the worst day in Israel's history. It was also the worst intelligence failure in their history, a history that has some other intelligence failure, Yom Kippur War prominent among them. It's the worst military readiness failure. The response by the military was totally, wholly inadequate. And it was the worst political miscalculation at the very top, where the prime minister thought that Hamas was becoming a responsible stakeholder, a good neighbor, and appreciative of the additional worker visas and so forth, which they're actually using to conduct reconnaissance of the targets they would take down in that horrific, barbaric, but very, very diabolically clever and creative attack. My concern at this point is that while Israel has done enormous damage to Hamas, their objectives were to destroy Hamas, ensure that they don't govern again and get the hostages back. First of all, that's lacking a component, which is what about the Palestinians in Gaza? How do you provide a better life for them? The real problem, though, is that the campaign plan on which they're embarked does not achieve the destruction of Hamas, nor ensure that they won't have influence again. They're not going to govern again, perhaps, but they are still influential. What is actually running Hamas right now? It's basically guys with guns, criminals, Hamas remnants, which continue to reconstitute Palestinian Islamic Jihad remnants. So you have to have a different campaign design. You have to do what we did during the surge in Iraq, which is clear, hold, and build, not clear and leave, which is what we were doing during 2006, prior to the surge, as the civil war in Iraq, the Sunni-Shia civil war, escalated to terrifying levels. It's not popular in Washington, nor in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. They have to reoccupy Gaza, I think, or you can never provide for a better future for the Palestinian people, nor can you ensure that Hamas is truly destroyed and not able to reconstitute and does not have influence inside that territory. If you don't do that, even controlling the southern border now, which I applaud, and they should never be forced to give that up. They should never allow the Rafah crossing in the south to be used to transit weapons, ammunition, explosives, the material that built the 350 miles of subterranean, not just tunnels, but underground factories in which they produce these rockets and drones and missiles and so on. They should keep that, and the tunnels that went under it, they've cut those as well. But they need to go back in a systematic way, clear areas, just go in a mile, east-west wall, couple north-south walls, create gated communities, such as we did on a near daily basis in Iraq, miles of wall. Walls actually do work if you don't have a 1,500-mile border with your neighbor, as we have in southern US. And then start to bring in humanitarian assistance in an organized fashion. That's not possible right now. Begin restoration of basic services, get people back in the area of their homes, even if they're damaged. Better makeshift or temporary accommodations for them, get them through the winter and so on. And then start to introduce trained and equipped in Jordan under US supervision, Palestinian security forces, and start to reestablish local governance and produce a better future for the Palestinian people. You just keep doing this all the way down. By the way, it's the only way you're actually going to prevent Hamas from reconstituting, truly destroy them, and again, have a chance of providing a better life for the Palestinian people. And that means it's the only way you're ever going to have a situation in which you have Palestinians living in Gaza in peace with their Jewish Israeli neighbors in Israel.
So, General, you mentioned the critical role of the United States in all of these conflicts. How do you see the upcoming elections potentially impacting the trajectory of these conflicts? What could potentially change and what will not change?
Sure. I mean, one candidate would represent much more continuity, obviously, than with the other. Although there has been a great deal of continuity from the Trump to the Biden administrations when it comes to the Far East in particular. Trump changed the conversation rightly on China. The Biden administration has fleshed out to be a truly comprehensive, integrated whole of governments, all allies and partners together, shored up alliances and so forth. But again, a return of President Trump would mean less enthusiasm, obviously, for Ukraine, less enthusiasm for multilateral organizations. The problem here, and anybody that tries to predict what the Trump policies would be, I think is really shooting in the dark, because we do not know who the key people around him will be. We don't know how the impact of, say, in Congress, a very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, and allies such as Lindsey Graham, very close to Trump, but absolutely determined that we continue the policy and the support in Ukraine. So again, all of this coming together, I think, is really hard to predict, although I think clearly there will be a difference with respect to a return of President Trump to the White House, much more obviously than Vice President stepping up to become the president.
One last question. So we've discussed a very disruptive, uncertain geopolitical context, and it is rightfully so. But do you see among these risks and interconnected risks some opportunities?
Oh yeah, I mean, every risk has an opportunity, every single one. I mean, every development. So what we do in the KKR Global Institute, together with our global macro team and the ESG team, is identify, okay, so here's a trend, higher labor costs in China, as an example. It's not a threat, if you will, it's just a reality. So who wins? Well, Vietnam wins. They've really benefited from this. India. You know, there's a recognition you shouldn't have all your manufacturing and assembly in one part of one country of Apple phones, especially if they shut you down for zero COVID for 5 weeks and no production is done. Well, where are the new Apple phones being produced? In India. And by the way, they're already starting to export substantial numbers. If you're concerned about the origins of supply chain items, friendshoring is a result of that. Who wins? Mexico, although not winning as much as they should because of the issues of the deterioration of rule of law and the populism in the federal government. So every one of these, we have one called the weaponization of everything. Everything is being weaponized. Well, that leads to the security of everything, and there are opportunities as a result of all that. So yeah, we spend a great deal of time trying to identify not just the threats, the challenges, the trends, the developments that are emerging, but then what does that mean in terms of opportunities where our deal teams should be seeking those. And that's how we target. We also look at countries that we think we should be in that we weren't. This led to KKR being the first into the Philippines in a really sizable way. And again, we do big deals, not small deals. And I think we've now done 6 or 7 quite large deals in the Philippines where we recognize that, yes, President Duterte is the president. Yeah, that's a headline risk, big time. But not really, unless you're in the drug business, the illegal narcotics business. If you're in the rest of the economy, we found out they have competent economic and financial team, all the major families, if you will, the major industrial partners, quite solid on that. Our embassy felt good. And so despite that headline risk, we went back years ago. In fact, my institute played a significant role in pushing for investment there, and now we actually have a team there and so forth. Lots of other cases of that, including, by the way, in the former Yugoslavia. We had a very large telecommunications, 1.5 billion, and we exited at 2 billion. Every one of those countries presented problems, but we were able to solve every one of those problems as well. So again, an awful lot of this is about identifying what are the implications of what we're seeing happening and then taking advantage of those, ideally, before others recognize those.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you. Thank you all very much. Thanks so much. That was good. You did very well.